CDBG DR and CDBG MIT application training workshops. My name is Amy Barnhill. Hopefully most of you know me already, but if you don't, I'm the CDBG Program Operations Coordinator. Before we get started, as a necessity, it seems like with all webinars, we have to go over a little bit of etiquette. And so I will remind everybody to please mute your phones or your computers if you aren't speaking, so we don't have any interruptions and terrible feedback, and we can keep on schedule as best as possible. We also have the capability to mute everybody. So I think Candace is probably going to be handling that for us. But if we have somebody slip through the cracks, we might call you out by name, so watch out. Today's workshop is going to be, and just if for the call-in users, if you are muted, I think that you can do a *6 to unmute if you ever have a question you want to bring up. But everybody else should just be able to mute themselves at the bottom with the microphone with the red line through it. Same thing on your phones. Today's workshop is going to be on program and application overview for both CDBG DR and CDBG MIT. We apologize for the short notice on these trainings, especially due to the timeline given on the applications, but we hope that breaking them up over the course of 4 weeks will help answer some questions as you work through the application process prior to submission. Ella, you want to move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is the schedule of these trainings as shown. Today, again, is program and application overview, as well as hopefully an application walkthrough if we have time permitting towards the end. Next Friday, September 25th, we'll cover developing a project budget and have specific overview on detailing the budget's activity, delivery costs versus our normal CDBG program allowance for administrative costs. And that will be mostly handled by Jamie Pine. The following Friday, October 2nd's training, we'll have a detailed overview of the LEP, Limited English Proficiency 4-factor analysis, as well as a little deeper discussion on the program's required citizen participation. And the final installment will be an in-depth discussion on environmental review requirements. And we are recording. I just see our little record button up in the top. So we are recording all these webinars and we'll circulate if requested to any applicants. So today's agenda is to do program overviews on both the CDBG DR and CDBG MIT programs, to include each program's funding distribution, program breakdowns, the all-important meeting a national objective, the benefiting of the MIDs, which is the most impacted and distressed areas, the application process, which is basically going to be a brief overview of the program guidelines, and an application walkthrough, again, time permitting. And then we will have, we're hoping to have some Q&A time at the end as well. But feel free, if you want, you can use our chat function to ask any questions, or you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can save your questions till the end. So before we get into the meat of everything, I wanted to kind of give an overview of all the staff that will be working on this program. This isn't an all-encompassing list of all CDBG staff. So if your favorites are missing, don't worry, they aren't gone. They're just not going to be as heavily involved in the DR and MIT specific programs as our DR and MIT teammates will be. So getting started, Sam Como is our boss. He is the CDBG Basically Everything Program Manager. Again, my name is Amy Barnhill. I'm the Program Operations Coordinator tasked with project development. Kim Stiefer and Allison Anderson are our Environmental Review Specialists. Jana Latham, Amanda Brush, Whitney Craven, and Walter Baker are our DR and MIT field representatives that will handle the projects once funded. Amy Werner, who is a regular CDBG field rep, a regular program field rep. She's also our Section 3 coordinator and is in charge of our fair housing and civil rights compliance. And so that obviously has quite the spillover into the DR and MIT programs as well. Jamie Pine is our financial analyst for all programs. Marina Stevers is our systems analyst for all projects that are run through HUD DRGR system, which includes both the DR and mitigation programs. Jennifer Wickham is our risk management coordinator and handles our single audit requirements. And last, but probably the most important, is Candace Buford. She's our program coordination specialist who basically coordinates all of the madness around the office, or what we now call our virtual office, and makes everything work for us. Okay. So the two programs that we're going to be discussing today are our 2017 CDBG DR, specifically that number, amendment number 2, that was for funds for public infrastructure, and our 2017 CDBG mitigation funds, which have a total combined allocation of over $140 million. And before I pass it over to Jana Latham, who's going to go into some program details, I just wanted to point out that today's speakers will include myself, Jana Latham, and Ella Cambernbeck, who is a HUD hired consultant of ours for the CDBG MIT program specifically. So Jana will be speaking mostly towards CDBG DR, and Ella will cover a lot of the CDBG MIT requirements, but we are all here, as well as several of the staff members mentioned, hopefully all of them, to answer any questions that you have. So again, feel free to ask questions, use our chat function. I saw that Candace said that she was going to be monitoring the chat, so use that if you are on your computer. If you are a call-in user, again, I think it's *6 will unmute yourself, as well as the double mute on your phone. And I'll pass it over to Jana to talk about program disasters covered by these funds.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everybody. This is Jana Latham, and I am a disaster recovery specialist and a mitigation. So the funds that were allocated to the state of Missouri for the infrastructure program for the disaster recovery was allocated in January of 2020. There was $9,847,018 that was allocated to the state of Missouri to support the unmet infrastructure recovery needs, which were related to the 2017 disaster events that occurred between April 28th and May 11th of 2017. A total amount that will be allocated to the infrastructure program will be $9,354,668. And they will include 80% of the funds will be allocated to the HUD identified areas, which includes the zip codes there, the 5, which includes Carter counties, Howell County, Newton County, Ripley, and Taney counties. And these are a list of, this slide represents a list of the 55 presidentially declared counties directly tied to the 2017 disaster events, which 20% of the funds may be allocated to the remaining counties outside the mid, as long as there are funds available.
All right, can everybody hear me? Hopefully. I'm Ella. Like Amy mentioned, I am a consultant working with the state of Missouri through HUD. So going to take it a step back and give you guys a little overview of the deadlines that the state has to meet in order to make these disaster recovery and mitigation funds available to all of you. So the way these programs work is they are allocated through congressional appropriations, and those appropriations are based on unmet needs. So after a disaster, Congress says, okay, here's the unmet need that we've identified, and as a result, here is an allocation to whoever is in need, in this case, the state of Missouri, to address those issues. So that piece has happened. HUD lays out all of the rules for the funding through Federal Register notices. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So that Federal Register notice is what governs the allocation. It says, here's what you can do and here's what you can't. Then the state of Missouri is responsible for putting together an implementation plan and financial certifications. So essentially, that consists of the state saying, hey, we can handle these funds and this is how. These are the financial management systems that we have in place to ensure that these funds will be spent compliantly. Those plans and that set of documentation has to be provided to HUD at 60 days from the release of the Federal Register notice. So Missouri reads the rules, then says, okay, here's how we are going to follow those rules. Then they had to release an action plan, and that action plan is under review by HUD now. It lays out everything Missouri intends to do. So if you haven't taken a look at it, we're going to give you a lot of sneak peeks into it today, but it is posted on the DED website. So I highly recommend you take some time. I know nobody has a lot of free time these days, but prioritize a read through of it because it's a great snapshot of how Missouri identified need and then how they took that need and turned it into programs that you guys are eligible to apply for through these programs. And there's both a disaster recovery, a CDBG DR action plan, and a mitigation CDBG MIT action plan. So there's two separate documents that speak to the two separate funding sources. HUD, of course, has to take time to review the action plan and the certifications. You know, they are allowed to come back and ask questions and work with the state to make sure that those documents are in tip-top shape. And then after HUD approves them, that's when HUD will issue a grant agreement, which is the contract that says, okay, we as the federal government agree that you are able to handle these funds, so here's the access to them. Then, of course, from there, Missouri will be able to draw down on the funds. That's how you guys get funding for your projects. And two key pieces here and a key difference between the DR program and the mitigation program. On the DR side, the full grant has to be expended within 6 years of that execution date of the grant agreement. However, on the mitigation side, HUD wants about 50% of the funds to be expended in 6 years, but the program has a full 12 years to fully execute the grant. And I think we're going to talk more about the similarities between the programs and the differences, but this is a key difference, and it's based in the intent and the scale and scope that HUD is looking for relative to projects that these programs propose. So on the DR side, we're looking back. Projects have to tie back to the disaster, and we're trying to meet a need that, or a loss, complete a loss that was created by the disaster. So the sooner we implement the funds, the better. But on the mitigation side, we're going to be looking forward. We're looking to enhance systems that are existing or create new ones that will make us stronger. So HUD is looking for bigger projects, higher impact, and as a result, they're giving more time to get those funds on the ground. All right, so digging into the DR program specifically, a little background on the program. Many of you guys are probably familiar with the regular CDBG program, and the DR program is derived from that. It comes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and like we mentioned before, it's a program that's provided as a special appropriation by Congress to impacted states, cities, counties to assist with the long-term recovery of presidentially declared disasters. So, you know, a key thing to keep in mind is FEMA is the group that comes in the immediate aftermath. They're serving those, you know, really critical first primary needs, you know, the clearing of debris, et cetera, getting, you know, people compensated for that immediate loss. But these CDBG-DR funds from HUD are aiming for those to meet those long-term recovery goals. And that's why we've got 6 years to expend them. And the process for planning how they're going to be expended takes a little longer in the development of that action plan et cetera. So, but like the regular program, it is relatively flexible. So it allows DED to create, the programs that they need the most, that they identify the state as needing the most, and then pass them down to you guys to spend. Like the regular CDBG program, the DR side prioritizes LMI persons and geography. So we ideally want as many of these projects to meet an LMI national objective. And all funding is subject to 24 CFR Part 570, which is just a fancy way of saying the Code of Federal Register. So those are the rules, again, that dictate these funding sources. And like I mentioned before, that Federal Register notice is essentially an announcement that comes along with the allocation or the appropriation to say, we've got these general rules set in that are established by the regular program, but we're going to add in a couple waivers or unique requirements for these disaster recovery dollars because of the particular disaster or the need that needs to be met. In terms of program requirements, all DR funds have to meet an eligible activity. So just like the regular program, you've got to meet a national objective, just like the regular program. And we'll get more into those national objectives a little later in the presentation. A set piece of the funds have to be spent in the mid, that most impacted and distressed area that Amy mentioned earlier. And we're going to get into how you document a project's impact to the mid. And on the DR side, 80% of the overall grant has to be spent in the mid. So that's something to keep in mind as you're putting together your applications. It's really critical that you're providing DED with that documentation to say, this is where our project is located, inside or outside the mid, and this is how we're going to measure its impact within that area and on that area. And the real key to the DR program is that projects have to have a tie back to the qualified disaster. So in order to have a project approved, you need to demonstrate that your project is meeting a need that was created by that 2017 disaster. And like I said, we've got to document that tie back. So it's not enough to say like, oh yeah, we tie back. We need that quantitative justification for the link back to the qualifying disaster. So a few ways to do that as you're developing your applications and thinking through projects to submit to the program. You can use damage estimates, right? So right after the storms, as your city or county went through and documented what was impacted, you can use that documentation as justification for a tieback. So you're repairing or fixing or replacing something that was impacted. Any sort of reconstruction estimates that were done for things that were physically lost, any insurance claims, those are key, or any sort of photographic evidence, but we need to make sure that it has clear dates and timestamps. So we're documenting, when the loss occurred. Any questions there? Because this is a really important one. All right, if you've got questions at the end, you can let us know. So then switching over to the mitigation side and going over this program. So the CDBG MIT program is brand new. This is the first round of the CDBG MIT funds. And it was created in part with and kind of in response to the 2017 DR fund. So that's why we're talking about these programs in tandem and why the applications are coming out at a similar time. So essentially, what Congress and HUD realized is, time and time again, year after year, we have disasters and HUD allocates disaster recovery funds, but those funds are always looking back, right? We've got that tieback requirement. They're always thinking back on what was lost and trying to replace it. But, the reality of our world today is that disasters are happening more frequently and they seem to be getting bigger each year. Maybe that's my perception, but it seems that there was enough consensus around that. So what HUD and and Congress decided is they wanted to create a program that had a similar structure to DR, but was forward-looking. So instead of having to tie your project back to the disaster, mitigation funds need to show how they are going to make your community more resilient and stronger for future disasters. HUD has created a definition for mitigation, which you'll see as kind of a sub-bullet here under what is mitigation. And I'm going to read it word for word because it's critical. HUD is saying that mitigation activities are those that increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to and loss of property, and suffering and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. So any project that you propose to the CDBG MIT program has to meet that definition. And as you're working through your application, the narrative piece of that application, those questions are really driving at or attempting to get you guys to justify how the project you're proposing meets this definition. So if you're thinking about applying to the mitigation program, if you're already in the process of it, I encourage you to print out this definition, stick it on your desk or next to your computer, and keep it in mind as you're completing that application, because this is the real key to eligible projects. And again, mitigation projects are for preventative measures instead of the recovery. So we're forward-looking instead of tying back. All mitigation programs must meet that definition of mitigation, address the current and future risks as identified in the mitigation needs assessment. So in Missouri's action plan, they did a mitigation needs assessment that assessed based on past storms, what are the needs to make the state and make communities, especially those located in the most impacted and distressed areas, stronger. So I think that the needs assessment is in Chapter 4 of the Mitigation Action Plan. Highly recommend you give that a read so you can see where the state is coming from in developing these projects and what need they're attempting to meet. On the DR side, there's also a needs assessment done by the action plan, but it's an unmet needs assessment. So again, that difference between looking back at what hasn't been addressed in terms of recovery and looking forward in terms of what needs to be done to make a community more resilient. Just like the DR side, we need eligible activities. Those are the same as the regular program, and we need to meet a national objective. We'll talk about those national objectives in a few slides, but HUD did create a new national objective for the mitigation program, and it's urgent need mitigation. So you might be familiar with the urgent need national objective. They've tweaked it slightly on the mitigation side and are requiring a little more justification and documentation for why something is an urgent need. In terms of goals, again, linking to that extended timeline, that 12-year window for expending funds, HUD really wants to see high impact projects. So they want you to think a little bigger and bolder in that scale and scope. And they want to see a focus, especially, of course, on the infrastructure side, a focus on repetitive lost properties, and critical infrastructure. So, if time after time, disaster after disaster, the same things are being impacted, and we're always, on the disaster recovery side, kind of looking back and trying to repair them. From the mitigation perspective, how can we make them stronger? How can, maybe it's about moving them or relocating that infrastructure or that facility so it's not impacted in the future. Again, we're building on that mitigation needs assessment and really looking to hazard mitigation plans, how we can update those, how we can implement pieces of them, maximizing impact of available funds. So HUD is encouraging partnerships and leverage for these mitigation dollars if it makes sense for the project. And another kind of new piece to this mitigation side is HUD has adopted FEMA's community lifelines, which there are 7 of, and we'll dig into the next slide. But HUD wants to see that the projects you're proposing are making these community lifelines more resilient. So there are 7 in total: safety and security, communications, food and water, shelter, transportation, health and medical, hazardous materials management, and energy infrastructures. So these are services that are critical to the operation of our communities. And when they're down, we're the most impacted, right? When they go down during a disaster, they're the first things we need to tend to. So what HUD would like to see is the enhancement and the strengthening of these lifelines so they don't go down in future disasters. They can continue operating, they continue running, and our communities are less impacted as a result. So again, why are yeah.
Can I stop you for a minute? We had a question in the chat I just wanted to bring up before we move too much further. Crystal Jones asked with MIT being for preventative measures, we would not have had to have that quantitative information for the project to be eligible, such as damage estimates, insurance claims, et cetera, correct?
Exactly, Crystal. So right, so there is no tieback requirement for these mitigation funds. HUD is basically taking care of the tieback. They're saying, we've released these mitigation dollars to you because we know you were impacted by the 2017 storms. So tieback, we don't care about, right? What they want to see instead on that quantitative side is how the project will make you stronger. So it's easier in a sense, right? Because you don't have to tie it back, but there is a challenge there because HUD does want justification for how these projects will positively impact or strengthen a community. So it's not that you're off the hook in terms of justifying the need of the project. You're just justifying the need in a different way. Instead of justifying the need as saying, hey, we lost this and we have to replace it, you're saying, hey, we've never had this, and as a result, we've had these impacts. So if we put this in place, we will in turn be stronger and have less impacts in the next flood or storm event. Does that make sense? And we're also going to talk about in a little while, the DR funds and the mitigation funds can be used together, but the project scope will have to meet the requirements of both programs. So we'll get into that in a little bit as well. So then jumping back to the community lifelines and why they're important, I think we've talked about most of this stuff, but again, when they're disrupted, that rapid response is required. So if they can be strengthened, so there is less or no disruption in a disaster event, then the community is able to bounce back faster. So again, as you're putting together your applications, keep these community lifelines, the 7 community lifelines in mind, and how the proposed project connects to them or is a piece of them. Oh, let's see if we can get the slide to change. There we go. And, you know, again, these are hopefully common sense. Is there a question? No, okay. Of why these themes of resilience and mitigation are critical. But, you know, again, we've seen these repeat disasters, and any sort of reduction in current and future risk is really essential to really the survival of our communities, our economic well-being, and our overall security. So, you know, being able to maximize the preparedness allows us to save lives. It brings long-term benefits to our community, and, you know, diminishes those impacts from the future events that, you know, we know are coming, but being prepared makes them, you know, a little less stressful. And just being able to protect people from, and people's property and community property from harm's way. So again, these are themes that you want to think about as you're putting your application together. How is your project going to reduce risk? How is it going to maximize your preparedness within the community? And how is your project going to protect people from harm?
Ella?
Yeah,
we have another question.
Oh, great.
Sarah Turner is asking, just to verify, does the community applicant who is applying for the MIT have to be in the disaster identified zip code areas?
So on the mitigation side, we have to see, HUD wants to see 50% of the funds being implemented within the within that most impacted and distressed area. And then the other 50% they want to see can be implemented outside of the mid, but we need to show that the project can still benefit the mid. So that is unique to these mitigation dollars. So, you know, I think between the HUD mid and the state identified mid in Missouri, pretty much everybody's covered. But you should always be thinking about, as you're designing these projects, even if you're outside of the mid, how your project is implementing that most impact, impacting that most impacted and distressed area. And again, that's why HUD is looking for these high impact, larger scope projects, because, you know, if you think about a lot of infrastructure projects, they might be located in one place, but the impact could be felt miles away. You know, if you're thinking about watershed management, if you're thinking about reductions in flooding, et cetera. So, you know, impact isn't always about the address of a project. But I think that is an added challenge for these funds in terms of justification and documentation of really thinking through what you're planning on doing and what are those like reverberating impacts and, you know, expanded impacts throughout your community and throughout your region. All right, so now we're going to dig into the specific programs, starting with the CDBG DR infrastructure program. And I'm going to let Jana take it from here.
Thank you, Ella. Okay, so on the infrastructure program, as you see here in the program budgets, that the housing will be included in the 4317, which is already active at this time. And then, like I had said in the previous presentation, the infrastructure program fund allocation happened in January of this year. And so this just kind of is just a little bit of an overview of the funds that are available currently for these two types of programs. Eligible uses of the disaster recovery infrastructure funds, they include water, sewer, stormwater, streets, bridges, drainage systems, drainage facilities. And the purpose of the funds for the program is just to address identified unmet disaster recovery needs from the disaster events from 17. And of course, cannot stress enough that we make sure that we demonstrate that tie back to those disaster events. And of course, we have to meet the eligibility requirements. And so, and I think Ella went over this before. She talked about the city and the counties, government entities demonstrating a direct tie back to the disaster. You know, and she had mentioned different ways to do that: photographs, insurance claims, reports, and so forth. And that's very important in the application process, because as we know, this is a competitive application. So we want to make sure we get all the information that we need. And of course, we're going to address the ongoing unmet infrastructure needs, like we had talked about earlier, in the local communities that are still have not been satisfied with the county, with the counties or the cities. And like I said, it's a competitive awards based on the application, and there is no project maximum threshold for the projects. And then, of course, we have to meet the national objective, which is LMI and the urgent need for the disaster recovery infrastructure program. And the funding is a little over $9 million that will be allocated for the infrastructure projects.
All right, and then on the mitigation side, back to me. We have both an infrastructure and a planning program. So we'll talk through both of those. On the infrastructure side, there are 4 sub-programs, essentially. There's a general infrastructure program. Oops, sorry that the allocation got a little cut off there. General infrastructure program, public facilities and hardening, a program specific for generators for critical facilities, which also read community lifelines, warning systems, and then the planning program. So each has a maximum award. So keep those in mind as you are crafting your projects. And again, we're really hoping for that LMI priority on all of them because it's critical in order for the state to meet their overall LMI benefit. On the infrastructure side, so again, I'm going to say it so many times, but you got to meet that definition of mitigation. And again, as you're working through the application, those narrative questions are really guided as prompts to get you to show how you're meeting this definition. But that's your focus. And also you're trying to address the current and future risks identified in the needs assessment, which are, again, chapter 4 of the action plan. And great thing for you to check out. I think that if I recall correctly, the state identified thunderstorms, flooding, both riverine and flash flooding, and tornadoes as like the 3 highest risks. So I think also keeping those within the mitigation needs assessment. So I think keeping those in mind as you're developing your projects to say, how is my proposed project mitigating against one or all of those high risk events? Also, when it comes to eligible uses, like we've talked about before, you've got to meet that eligible activity and meet a national objective. Again, LMI, or in the case of mitigation, not unmet need, that was a typo, urgent need mitigation. The acronym for it is UNM. So again, it's similar to the DR side, but what HUD is asking for with this new urgent need mitigation is that you provide, a quantifiable assessment of how you've identified that urgent need and how your project is going to mitigate against it. So some key elements of an eligible mitigation infrastructure project. And some of these also speak to the DR side. On both sides, it's really key, if you can, to address the needs of LMI and vulnerable populations. And not just say you're going to do it, but show DED how your project is going to do that. It's key to impact that most impacted and distressed area, whether you're within it and impacting it or outside of it and impacting it. And again, we've got that 50-50 split. 50% of the funds have to be implemented within the MID, and then 50% can be implemented outside, but have to show how they are impacting the MID. Meeting the definition of mitigation again and again, can't say it enough, and stabilizing those community lifelines. Some other key elements, and I think, kind of a common trait of HUD is they learn as they go, as we all do. And I think for the last few DR allocations, they've been, as they come out to monitor grantees, they've been asking for more measurable outcomes and goals, more performance metrics. And I think because they started asking for those things time and time again, now they've baked it into the mitigation program. So they really want to see those quantifiable impacts. They want to see how the proposed project has incorporated certain resilience measures. So HUD likes to say that resilience is a system's capacity to recover from adversity, a community's ability to rebound quickly from shocks and stressors, while at the same time reducing future risk. So I think that's another key definition to keep in mind as you are developing your project, right? Like, how is your project improving your community's ability to rebound from or be less impacted from a stressor or a disaster? HUD wants to see the incorporation of natural and green infrastructure. So they want these projects to be resilient. They want them to be forward thinking. So, you know, look to how you can incorporate those elements. They want to see that these projects are cost effective. And part of that is not just in the initial budget, right? So especially on the infrastructure side, some of these projects are going to be expensive, right? A lot of big infrastructure is. But ideally, by implementing the project, you're lessening future risk, which means there's a future cost savings that you're anticipating. So think about that as you're designing your budgets as well. By, you know, implementing these dollars up front, what type of cost savings will you see in the future by having those community lifelines stay online? By, you know, not having to do that crazy frantic response to get everything up and running again after it's, you know, impacted by a disaster. So those are important themes to keep in mind. And HUD also really wants to see that there's a capacity and a plan for the operations and maintenance of these projects moving forward. So again, that's something that HUD has started asking for in past DR allocations, and now they're saying you got to have it. So as you're planning for your budget, don't just think about, you know, the construction of the project. You need to be thinking about how you're going to keep this project operational and functional moving forward. So like I mentioned before, DR infrastructure and mitigation infrastructure can be used together on the same project. So you've got a couple options here, right? You can apply for just the DR side. You can apply just for the mitigation side. You can apply for both programs with two separate projects, or you could apply for both funding sources for the same project. But what you have to keep in mind is if you're looking at one project that's going to meet both program requirements, you're going to need a project scope that both has a tieback. So maybe, you know, it's, you know, a road that was destroyed by the 2017 disaster events. And so the DR funds could get it up to where it used to be, right? It can replace it, but then the mitigation funds can make it stronger. It can incorporate, you know, green infrastructure methods to make the road more sustainable and resilient moving forward. It can maybe elevate the road so it doesn't flood in the future. And again, that's not the most creative example. I urge you guys to be a little more creative, but do think about that. And again, HUD is encouraging that the leveraging of funds and in order to see more and greater impact. So if you have projects where you can create that marriage of the two programs, that is encouraged. And you know, Missouri timed these applications to roll out at the state, you know, under a very similar timeline. So you can be thinking about both at once, and so the funding cycles will be relatively synced up, and again, it makes it more conducive to do those combo projects if you know you have one in mind. This is a lot of information and it's tiny, but just wanted to give you a snapshot of kind of like how DR and mitigation line up on the infrastructure side. So again, in terms of funding to the mid, we want to see 80% of DR funds happening in the mid, whereas 50% need to be implemented within the mid on the infrastructure side. We've got a 70% LMI overall benefit on the DR side with a 50% on the MIT side. Tieback, like we mentioned before, Crystal, thanks for the question again, required to tie back to 2017 on the DR side, no tieback requirement on the mitigation side. You know, funding differences. And again, the difference between, we've got LMI priorities on both in the national objectives, but that urgent need, straight up urgent need on the DR side, urgent need mitigation on the mitigation side. And again, both are also eligible for the FEMA HMGP match if that is of interest to your community. In terms of ineligible infrastructure activities, and these apply also to the DR side, really, we got to steer clear of putting any of these funds towards private infrastructure. So private utilities, private roads and bridges. You know, on the mitigation side, HUD has said if your proposed project, you know, realizing that like disasters don't know what's private and public property, just like they don't necessarily care about, lines drawn within states or counties, et cetera. So if you are looking at an infrastructure project that is so large scale that there is, maybe a private road that is a component of it, you can work with DED to justify the overall community benefit to putting dollars towards that private space. But generally, if you can, I think, steer clear of trying to invest in any sort of private infrastructure, and keep in mind that these dollars are generated, from communities, right? They're a compilation of all of our tax dollars and tax dollars from all over the U.S. So we want them to be implemented in a way that serves the community at large and serves systems that the community can access. The CDBG MIT program also has planning funds available, and these applications can be submitted directly by cities and counties or from the regional planning commissions. And the idea of the planning funds is they can enhance existing plans to have a more mitigation focus, to look at that forward-thinking planning of how we're going to make communities stronger and more resilient. Or they can be used to create new plans if a plan is needed and identified. I think the key to these planning dollars is that, again, we want to prioritize those vulnerable populations, and both HUD and DED want to see that there's a capacity for both the planning, the development of the plan, and the implementation. So, while it's always great to come up with a plan, and I have a degree in planning, I'm a big fan of the process. I think we all are experienced with plans that get created and then gather dust on the shelf. So think about if you're applying on the planning side of mitigation and you're putting together that application as you're developing those narrative responses, really think about and talk about how you're going to prioritize the implementation, not just the creation of the plan.
Hey, Ella.
Yeah.
Question. Can multiple
Great.
RPCs and UGLUGs apply for a multi-jurisdictional planning project with an RPC as the lead applicant?
Oh, we're going to dig into partnerships in a couple of slides. And so I know that DED is encouraging partnerships, but Amy and Jana, I'm going to let you guys speak to that just so I don't make assumptions on behalf of your department.
I will speak a little bit towards it. In short, yeah, we're going to get to it here in a little bit, so forward thinking, Crystal, but basically, yes. The answer would be yes. So, yes, we're very much encouraging partnerships within all these projects, so we'll get to that here in a little bit. And with that, it is time to talk about national objectives, so that is all on me. National objective is arguably, I would argue, everyone's most valued phrase at CDBG. It means nothing to anyone outside of our world, but it means the world to everyone inside our world. So we're going to talk a little bit about all the national objectives, and I know that both Jana and Ella have talked about it already, but we're going to go into the specifics. So for the DR infrastructure, we have the standard low and moderate income persons, low and moderate income area benefit. And then we also have the standard urgent need national objective as usual as well. I'd just like to point out the stipulations that go with meeting this urgent need national objective. The community or the applicant must prove that there is a serious and immediate threat to the health and welfare of a community. They are of recent origin or recently became urgent, which HUD determines as within 18 months prior to the state grant recipient certification of the event. The community must prove they are unable to finance the activity on their own and prove that other funding sources are unavailable or there is a gap in financing to carry out the activity. The same with the national objectives. Eligible for mitigation infrastructure, LMI persons and LMI area benefit are allowed. and Ella spoke on it several times, but we're just going to keep drilling it into you. The urgent need mitigation, the UNM, is the new national objective criteria for this funding category. And basically, the difference is that this must address current and future risks identified in that mitigation needs assessment from the action plan, and they have to prove a measurable reduction in the risk. So this will be proven throughout the information in the application, including information asked in the narrative questions. So the basics on LMI area benefits. The benefits must be proven to be available to all residents in the area. The beneficiaries in the area must be at least 51% low and moderate income. As always, HUD does not allow for rounding up, so it can't be like 50.9, that's just shy. So we would have to have 51.0 or higher for it to be allowed. And then that service area must be primarily a residential area to prove that it is meeting that LMI national objective to those in that income. To determine the LMI national objective for LMI area, you must ensure the service area is accurate to prove that that project is eligible. So knowing things like the nature, size, and location of the activity, that's key. Knowing the accessibility barriers that exist in relation to the activity, such as language barriers, cost barriers, transportation barriers to the activity that could hinder somebody's easy access to benefiting from the activity. Knowing if there's a duplication of services already provided, you know, either the exact services or comparable services already provided in the area where there might not really be a true benefit from this activity, and then any other potential boundaries. So how do you calculate LMI? If you're lucky, you get deemed LMI by HUD's, what we call HUD's census data from the American Community Survey. Or if a community isn't deemed LMI by HUD census data, then they could perform a local income survey to try and prove that they are LMI. Both HUD census data from 2015, which is the most current that's being used right now, and the 2020 income limits for DR and mitigation, if a survey is necessary, are found on our website, which is ded.mo.gov/CDBG. So if you don't meet LMI by that HUD census data, then a local survey can be done to try and prove LMI. The ways we allow those surveys to be done is door-to-door surveying, mailing the surveying, perhaps with any existing community service or utility bills. Telephone surveys are now allowed as long as we're notating the telephone number that was called for the survey. And then we also allow for electronic surveys to be done via web or email, especially because everybody knows we're living in quite the virtual time right now, hence our virtual training. So the main items that are to be included on the survey that are standard on our survey form is the number of families in the household, the number of persons per family in the household, the range in which their family income lies based on their number of persons in their family. So they don't have to specifically tell us the exact dollar amount they're earning on their taxes. We just kind of give a range based on the number of persons, and they can just say that they fall between this range or that range. And then their race and ethnicity information is also gathered on that survey. So to have a valid survey, there are two options. If a community that needs to be surveyed has 200 or less households in the project area, then all the households must be surveyed. If a community has an area that needs to be surveyed that has more than 200 households, then a random survey must be completed. The way that this is done is the community would provide an Excel spreadsheet to our office, mostly to me, with a list of each occupied residential address, one per row on the Excel spreadsheet no headers. I know it's super picky of me to say, but that's the way we have to do it, so that way it can tie back to the answers, the responses that we're going to give you. Because HUD has guidance based on the number of households in the project area to determine the minimum number of responses based on that area size. And our office will then provide you with a randomized list of addresses to be solicited, and that randomized list of numbers will tie back to the address rows on the Excel spreadsheet that you provide. So that's why we have to be so particular that we can't start row 1 with a header that says address or city of whoever. It has to be 123 Main Street right there on row 1, and then 125 Main Street on row 2. All surveys, whether 100% solicitation or random solicitation, must receive a response rate of at least 80% to be deemed valid. Once that 80% or more response rate is received, then the survey results must be extrapolated out to the full population of the community for both the LMI determination and the racial information. And just to point out on there too, everybody's beloved fact finder went out of business or was taken away this year, and so the new website to find census information is data.census.gov. So calculating the LMI, it's just a simple math equation. It's either the LMI persons or LMI families divided by the total number of persons or families times 100 equals your LMI percent. HUD census data, again, it comes from a combination of the census information and the results from the American Community Survey. HUD combines both the income and the family size data, and then they send out income data for information at the county level, cities, places, towns, townships, census tracts, block groups. We have it all, and it should, I think the counties and cities and places and towns, I think that's all on our website as well. And then we do, again, we have the township information, census tract, and block group information on request for the state of Missouri only, because it is quite difficult to weed through the information on the entire nation. So we've made it easy and just cut the Missouri information out for you. And I think I'm turning it over to Ella or Jana 1.
That would be me. This is Jana again. And so I know that we've drilled this in throughout the presentation about the most impacted and distressed areas. But it's very important, especially for the 2017 DR infrastructure program. So as you know, the 80% of the funds will be in these areas, and the 20% if there's in the other areas, if we have funds left available, then we will apply that to those areas. So basically, and I, like I said again, Ella touched on this about demonstrating the tieback, having the proof, the damage. You know, it's very important to do that. And you know, and one of the how you can do this is through the geography. Maps will help with that to show that they're located in the mid. That will help us to determine that. The population of the area, which Amy touched on about the blocks, kind of know that information as well. The location of the project is very important. Like I said, we've already touched on this before. We have to ascertain whether or not it is in the mid. I mean, that is a big eligibility for us on this. The address, the latitude, the longitude, you know, that will help us, which when you do the environmental review, I think a lot of you always include that anyway on your geographical maps. The same thing with the map of the service area in the mid intersection. Sometimes in these cities or towns, they're just a little bit rural, but they still could be inside of the city limits or whatever. So sometimes those intersections, the addresses would help to determine that section where that's at. So if you've got a bridge, a low water bridge that we want to fix up that still exists from the damage from the 17 disaster event, then sometimes the best way to do it is just, give us some points. Of course, the latitude, longitude would help. If you've got an intersection address or just a road, that would help as well. And then, of course, the written justification. Just make sure you include all of this pertinent information with the application because, it's because we will look at all this information and, because it is a competitive award, we want to make sure that you beef up your application to show the need for this. Key takeaways on the infrastructure program. Once again, just remember, have to have the tie back to the 17 disaster event. Very important. Located inside the mid. Providing that detailed documentation on who the project serves in the communities, especially important for projects that don't have a clear service area, like your roads, your bridges, that kind of thing. That's very important. In the LMI calculations, as Amy just went over, make sure you include all the block groups, which she had touched on as well, that are within and that could partially overlap the service areas. Because if these partial block groups change the benefit area to below that 51% LMI, then consider doing an income survey as she had went over. Because like she had said, the example, 50.9% doesn't cut it for HUD for the 51%. So it's very important that we reach that LMI for the project, right? And then I'm going to turn it over. I think Amy is going to do the application guidelines.
Yes, I am. I will try to go through this as quickly as possible just so we can leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. I apologize. I'm quite long-winded. So the application process, an important part is that HUD has they have a requirement for the state of Missouri program to have citizen participation. And so what the state of Missouri has determined is the most beneficial way for us to kind of implement that out at a lower level to our grantees is by conducting a public hearing prior to the application, at which point the community would gather information to complete a needs assessment for the communities overall to determine that the proposed project does fall as a high priority for the community's needs. The state program requires that an initial public hearing be held prior to the application submission. We no longer have a stipulation of exactly when, especially because we only pretty much gave like a 60-day window for these applications. We can't say you have to do it so many months before because we didn't only give you 2 months. So, but we're kind of striking that overall across all programs. The program does require that a notice for the public hearing be given at least 5 full days prior to public hearing. So we call it the 5 full day rule, but it's really like the 7-day rule. So basically, if a meeting is scheduled on a Monday, the notice must be publicly given at least the Monday prior. Currently, counties are still bound to publish the notice by state statute, but cities are, again, currently given an allowance pending really a clear definition from HUD. There's arguments all the time at the HUD level about this, but we'll ask for forgiveness later, I guess, until we're told otherwise, that cities can post the notice rather than publish, but they by all means are allowed to publish as well. And because we are in the times of COVID-19, if communities are under any kind of public in-person attendance restrictions, We recommend you contact somebody on the CDBG team to determine the appropriate steps to allow for a variation of the public hearing, because we're trying to be very understanding. Obviously, we're hosting everything virtually and all of us working virtually as well. So if that needs to be an option in a public hearing for your project, we can work with you to get that into compliance. So to tie back to what Crystal's question was earlier on establishing partnerships, especially in our CDBG MIT and CDBG DR programs, we are very much encouraging establishment of partnerships between any programs available to leverage funds, as well as any local leveraging that is available. Partnerships between the RPCs and councils of governments are encouraged as well. And if there's multiple UGLUGs involved in one project, then, you know, having that intergovernmental agreement is also encouraged. So, you know, those intergovernmentals and those applicant, sub-applicant agreements, we have those as samples on the website for both CDBG MIT and CDBG DR. And those are, again, just samples. They can be tailored to fit the specific project's needs. That's what we are encouraging to be done. But we just kind of give a basis out there on the website. Some other specific partnerships that will be involved in the project will be professional services. So all projects, with the exceptions of those purchasing equipment only, such as the generator only projects or the warning system only projects. All projects besides those will require a preliminary engineering report or a preliminary architectural report. These reports are to be submitted from professionals that are licensed to do business in the state of Missouri. They have required contents in them. The specific guidelines that are on our website spell those out, but they're fairly standard to include project scope, alternate, cost estimates, photographs and maps, and any preliminary drawings that there will be. All projects will also have to have someone writing the grant. Oh, can you go back a slide? I don't think I was done with that one yet. Yeah, thank you. If the service isn't done by the grantee and that a third party is hired to accomplish this, those services must be procured as appropriate by their local procurement method, because neither preliminary engineering or architectural services or grant writing services are eligible for grant reimbursement. They're considered those upfront costs and therefore a responsibility of the applicant, but we want to ensure that they're still following their local procurement method as well. And then also just to point out, to avoid any conflicts of interest per all CDBG standards, the same firm or any principal of or employee cannot perform both engineering or architecture services and administration services for the same project, regardless of funding source. That would be considered a conflict, and we cannot allow that. So even though those upfront costs aren't eligible for CDBG, the procurement for these services throughout the life of a project can be pre-selected prior to application to benefit the application's rating to show project readiness. So to do so, for engineering or architectural services, an RFQ, request for qualification, must be solicited directly to an adequate number of NEBI-WEBI-DBs, which is minority, women, and disadvantaged business enterprises, as well as Section 3 firms, and documentation of that is explicitly important to prove that you try to create fair and open competition, as well as any other interested business firms. And it can also be published in the newspaper as well if necessary. So CDBG has a sample pre-selection RFQ for those services with sample evaluation and selection criterion. These services are specific that they do not require cost to be a factor. The slide says cost cannot be a factor, and I mean, I guess it kind of can, it just can't be the most important because these mainly have to be based on their qualifications. If they solicit for these services in conjunction with any of the preliminary work discussed on the previous slide, that will be allowed as long as the scopes are very definitively separated as well as the costs being separated. If surveying is proposed to be part of the project and that cost is separated out separately from the design work, then those must also be solicited and procured separately from the design work to be eligible. And as always, there must be an established deadline for response on these qualifications as well. So once qualifications are received, the specified criterion must be used to evaluate each proposal, check for references. After that, a community can determine their top candidates and interview them if they so choose, or they can just go right into negotiating the contract and cost. This is basically the one allowance on procurement that CDBG gives for contract negotiation for this service type only. Because they are based so strictly on qualifications. So after a top candidate is selected, contract negotiation can commence. CDBG, as always, will need to do a license and debar check on any of those services that are intended to be paid with CDBG funds. And because these are being pre-selected, if they are being pre-selected, please be sure to include a contingency clause in that contract. Okay, in preparation of the application, as always, we need to encourage the forethought of the environmental review that will be required on every project. I'm only going to give a high-level overview on this slide of environmental review because, as I stated earlier, our environmental review specialists, Kim Stever and Allison Anderson, will be doing an in-depth presentation on this in the 4th installment of these training series. So that's on October 9th at 9 a.m. As everyone hopefully knows, all of these projects will require some level of environmental review, even if it is exempt. That is still a level of environmental review. It just depends on what level of the environmental review applies to your project based on the activities within the project. And so on those activities, every activity proposed in the project, whether it's coming from CDBG fund or intending to be paid for with CDBG funds, or intending to be paid for with other funds, it must be covered in the environmental review, and it must be described in detail in both the application and discussed in the public hearing as well. So unlike the saying less is more, with environmental review, more is more. So we need to be able to get a full grasp of the appropriate scope of the project. So detail, detail, detail. The one exception that we will make on CDBG MIT program projects is that HUD gave an allowance for the CDBG MIT program to adopt an environmental review from a different federal agency. The stipulation is that they must request in writing from HUD the adoption of that other federal agency's environmental review. If it's not requested in writing from HUD, you can't just presume that it will be allowed to be utilized. And again, this is just high-level overview. In a few weeks, Kim and Allison will do a much more in-depth presentation. And just like that, project budget, again, next week, Jamie Pine and Ella, I think, will be working on an in-depth discussion on project budget. But we just kind of wanted to bring up a few key points while you're working on developing your project budget. Please be sure to include all funds contributing to this project because we will have to prove that there is no duplication of benefits. Be sure that you're factoring in Davis-Bacon and labor standard requirements when considering construction costs. And if acquisition is going to be required, please consider the time and expense needed to complete this process in accommodation of the Uniform Relocation Act requirements that are standard across all projects. In regards to risk assessment, these questions are included in the narratives for both the CDBG DR and CDBG MIT application narratives that are on our website. These do not factor into the scoring of the application. They simply just will allow our team to, design an appropriate monitoring plan and provide as much technical assistance as necessary based on the project need. So I know we only have 15 minutes. I saw Candace was putting some notes out. I feel like I would want to leave these 15 minutes for questions and answers if there are some. And then the application walkthrough, I just feel like questions might be more important at this point. Maybe we can tack that on to another training later. I do want to point out the 2 deadlines for both applications. CDBG MIT comes first. It's due October 23rd by 5 p.m. And the CDBG DR infrastructure is due the following Friday, October 30th at 5 p.m. as well. And I think we've got a few slides with some resources available to all of those active links. And I think, I don't know, is there one more slide, Ella? Oh yeah, deeper guidance on the local income survey, if I didn't go through it enough, are at these links as well.
Yeah, so we can open it up for questions.
Okay, I see the first one that came through was Chelsea. How long will it take to receive applications once they have been requested? Candace, do you want to answer that question? I think Candace is in charge in shelling them out, but I could be incorrect. Candace might be having issues with her mic, so we'll circle back to that one, Chelsea. Sarah Turner asked, can a community apply for MIT planning funding to use for preliminary planning and engineering? That is a good question.
So are you talking about like applying for planning funds to plan for a mitigation infrastructure project?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I think, and again, I don't want to make programmatic decisions for DED, but I think given the kind of the timelines of the two, I guess
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's specifically not allowed, but I don't know if it's going to meet what your intent is, because the planning will run concurrent with our infrastructure. So you might have a plan for infrastructure, and then
but
more
the
out of
infrastructure application will
funds.
be closed.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think, go ahead, Amy.
No, that was, I think that, you know, I mean, plans are plans, and we want, you know, plans obviously need, and you spoke to it earlier, Ella, need to have then an implementation associated with them. And that's what those mitigation plannings are for. But if it's planning just for the engineering on a project, I don't think it's going to play out the way that the program is intending.
Okay. I don't think I have. I usually use my mic, so I don't think I'm needed.
Just
I don't have.
Just to turn around for Chelsea, you should receive your application within, you know, that same day, if not like, you know, less than an hour later. And if you don't, then just give me a call. I do check that email, you know, multiple times a day.
Surely there's other questions.
Yeah.
Hi, Amy.
I know we're not that good at our job. Here we go.
Hey,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
it's Brandon Jensen with SimCog.
Hi,
I'm
Brandon.
Hey there, I'm driving to Monette, so I can't type my questions out, but I have a few questions. So the first is related to the DR infrastructure funding. Going back to the idea that any infrastructure that's funded with this project must be public. So does that include whenever a community is applying for funds on behalf of a private non-for-profit entity, looking at water, sewer, and road infrastructure to serve new housing for LMI folks? Am I correct in understanding that all of that infrastructure must be publicly held?
Jana, do you want to
Yeah.
answer? Or Ella, either one.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would ask, so Brandon, you're talking about a housing development that is needing infrastructure to attach to it for new housing, or?
Yes, yeah, so it's a nonprofit that's looking at constructing housing within a mid for low to moderate income folks. And the CDBG, so they're receiving federal home loan bank funds to pay for the actual construction of the structures, but they're looking at applying for CDBG funds to pay for the roads that will be on the site or within the site, as well as some water and sewer main extensions.
Okay, and so the infrastructure program is for public benefit and, not necessarily owned by the city. So, and this is a direct tie back to the disaster event?
Yes, yeah, it's the community experienced a severe decrease in housing. And so this project is seeking to create additional housing in response to that loss of inventory.
Okay. So then it appears that it could cover this project. So,
Get a definitive answer for you, Brandon, and we'll get back to you on it. We'll send you an email. We can send it out to everybody in case anybody else is wondering. But I feel like
and I think that sounds like a viable project.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like as long as so like the roads that would be constructed wouldn't be private access roads, right? It's like, anybody can drive on them. They're being maintained by, the county, et cetera. You've got the public benefit. And so, same with the infrastructure that you're putting in place with water, sewer access. I think, all of that's fine and good. And if you can show that that community was impacted directly, so that, then you could do the DR side, or on the mitigation side, if you can show that where this community is being placed is, of less risk, it's, less potential impact in future disasters, you may even be able to tie it in the mitigation side.
Okay. Talking about mitigation, so going back to the discussion about environmental review, and we can talk about this I think it may be too late for the October 9th based on the timeline I'm working with the community on. So you said CDBG can accept another funding agency's environmental review. Does that still hold true if the other agency doesn't require a HUD 8-step determination process, but it would be required under CDBG's?
So the key to it is you can submit another federal agency's environmental review.
Yes, it is another federal agency.
Okay. Yeah. So, like, is it a FEMA environmental review that's been done or that's being done?
It's actually an EDA environmental review.
Okay. Yeah, I think the key to it is just that first we would need to request from HUD, the kind of like the approval to submit this, and it would certainly have to be reviewed to make sure that there aren't any holes in it or that, DED and HUD don't have any questions. But yeah, if you're going through that process already, and it's another federal agency's environmental review process, it very well could carry you on the CDBG side. But now I can't say definite just because we've got to see the review, but yeah, it's a possibility. And then you would just, in the same way that you do any other process, make sure that it's documented. You maintain both that request and the review in your files, for future monitoring.
Okay.
And Brandon, just so that you know, we're currently doing some projects right now for the voluntary buyout and the multifamily projects, and that does apply as well. Where if we adopt another agency's ER, however, if if CDBG requirements aren't met, then we will follow up with that as well, because we still have to meet the CDBG requirements to the ER.
Okay.
And,
So this
but
won't
Kim
let us
and
out of
them,
the 8-step.
Kim and Allison will touch on that too, on their series coming up.
Okay.
Brandon,
And then,
this Brandon. Hey,
yeah,
this is Kim Steefer. Can you touch base with me offline, because I'm just wondering why another federal agency wouldn't require an 8-step, but we could talk about it offline.
okay. And then,
Brandon, you're cutting out really bad.
at ADC. Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
We can't hear you, Brandon.
Okay, I
No.
am probably just out of service. I'll ask you off.
I assume you're saying you're going to shoot us an email, so that'll work. And let's see, there's a couple questions in the chat. Let's scroll back to the one. Mitzi, once an application is submitted, what is the expected timeline to hear about the award? Great question. We hope to have awards out, always as soon as possible. I'm unsure about an exact timeline, but we'll be able to probably, if we don't know now, Jamie probably will be able to maybe cover on that next week. If not, we'll bring answers next week. But we're pretty much assuming about 30 days.
I do want to loop back on that. If you guys remember from the very beginning of the slide deck, we went over that the timeline that DED is responsible for including the implementation plan and the action plan and putting together all of those pieces that say to HUD, hey, we're capable of receiving and executing these funds. And so a key piece of that is the grant agreement between the state of Missouri and HUD. And that's when HUD says, okay, here's the money, right? And so that piece hasn't happened yet. I think, DED is being super proactive. They're getting these applications out on the street. They want you guys to be thinking about these projects. So that way, as soon as the grant agreement happens, they can move forward, with the projects that you guys have proposed. But, HUD has, many federal agencies they operate on their own timeline, and the DED in Missouri don't have any control over when HUD says, okay, here's the grant agreement. They're kind of at the mercy of HUD there. So, that is a critical component of when funds will actually be available.
Thank you, Ella. And then one last question, because I know Crystal has asked this before, and I don't know if we got a response back. Can an UGLUG apply for multiple generators in different critical facilities? Long answer short, yes. We want it to be meeting, those critical facilities, those community lifeline requirements. But obviously we know that there are multiple critical facilities within a unit of general local government. So it would be accepted for multiples to come in under that unit of general local government, multiple requests for generators in one application. And let's see, we had another question about projects being undertaken by a private nonprofit for community benefit. So we will get a definitive answer out to everyone on that. And that's all I'm seeing in the chat. Before we close, because I know we are actually a minute past, but we got a minute late. Is there any other questions anybody wants to voice over the phone or in the chat? Okay, the appropriate amount of time for response was given. So I appreciate everybody being on today and listening. And again, if you have questions, feel free to email us. We are all still working through all of this. So, and if it hasn't been covered today and it looks like it might be covered in one of the upcoming series, then save your questions for then. Otherwise, hopefully we see everybody and more next week. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Mark your calendars for next week.